Good morning. Welcome to my first ever video sermon, and maybe yours as well. I'm going to be preaching on the passage that you just heard read from the Gospel of Luke. So I've seen several local TV news segments about residential fires that have happened, including one at an apartment complex. And in one of those interviews, I heard a firefighter who was some kind of supervisor say that the biggest problem there was not the fire itself, but people trying to go back into the building before the apartments had been deemed safe by the fire department. Why would people be willing to go into a potentially dangerous, smoldering building? The officer didn't say, but presumably it was in order to get their stuff, to see what they could salvage from their belongings. They wanted to save some things that were valuable to them. The supervisor's closing statement to the TV reporter was that nothing is worth risking your life to go back in. Nothing. No thing on this earth is worth risking your life to go back into a burning building. But it points to an age-old problem, our love of stuff. That brings us to the scripture lesson from the Gospel of Luke that you just heard, the one in which Jesus tells the parable of the farmer. So this guy had heard Jesus teaching the crowds, and he had decided that this Jesus fellow seemed like he might be qualified to settle a dispute that he had over an inheritance. Perhaps he sensed that Jesus would be a fair judge of these matters, and so the guy calls out to Jesus, "Teacher, order my brother to give me a fair share of the family inheritance." There were guidelines for cases like that from the Jewish law, from our Old Testament, both in Numbers 27 and in Deuteronomy 21. But at least in the opinion of this guy, those laws were not being followed. This kind of ugly dispute is all too familiar to all of us. Haggling over furniture, knickknacks, dishes, silverware, jewelry, you name it, left by a loved one. You've either heard about it or you've witnessed it firsthand in your own family situation. I know somebody that I grew up with who did not even know his own cousins who lived in the same town. The reason he didn't know his cousins was because years before, his parents and his cousin's parents, who were siblings, had had a dispute at the time of the death of their own parents. A dispute over stuff. And so even in our small town, these cousins didn't know each other. I knew them both. Jesus is asked to be a referee in a case like that, but he doesn't get sucked into it. His response, Jesus' response, gives me the impression that he figured that both of the brothers were being greedy in one way or another. Jesus then turns to the crowd and he gives a warning. It's a proverb, really, and I want to share it with you from a paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. Jesus says, "Protect yourself even against the least bit of greed. Life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot." And then Jesus elaborates with a parable about a farmer who has been so successful that he runs out of room to store all that his land has produced. The farmer determines that the thing to do is to tear down his barns and build bigger ones so he can hold on to all the fruits of his labor and retire and start taking it easy. But just then, God showed up and said, "Fool, tonight you die, and your barn full of goods, who gets it?" And Jesus follows the parable with another proverb. He says, "That's what happens when you fill your barn with yourself and not with God." That's also a paraphrase from The Message. Or another way to put it is, that's what happens when you make yourself or your stuff into your God. You know, we can say with Jesus, as he says in Luke 12:15, "My life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." But the world is constantly shouting at us that that's not true. And the result is this sort of wrestling in our hearts, in our soul, that despite the fact that we say we believe Jesus' words, that life is not about an abundance of possessions, we still find ourselves devoting a lot of our time, our talents, and our resources to acquiring more stuff. We say that our lives do not consist in an abundance of possessions, but often we live as though they do. Some years ago, I read a book by United Methodist pastor Adam Hamilton. The title of the book is Enough. I think that one of your previous pastors of this congregation may have shared a sermon series with you out of that book. If you're not familiar with the book, I commend it to you because he really cuts to the chase and really understands where we are in our culture, in our world today, in relation to our possessions. And Hamilton names this condition as restless heart syndrome, RHS, he calls it. And he says the primary symptom of RHS is discontent. We find that we are never completely satisfied with anything. The moment that we acquire something, we hardly take the time to enjoy it before we find that we want something else. And so we are continuously discontent. Discontentment, on the one hand, can be good, but it can also be bad. It just depends what we're discontent about. Discontentment can be a virtue. There's a certain discontentment that God intended for us to have. God has wired our hearts so that we would be discontent with certain things, and that discontentment would cause us to reach out to God, seek the one who can fully satisfy us. That's a positive discontent. It can cause us to yearn to know God more. It can move us into a deeper prayer life, motivate us to get out into the world and do something to make a difference. It can move us to love others more, to grow in grace, to grow stronger in character and in wisdom day by day. That kind of discontent is a good thing. But discontent can also be destructive. The problem is that those things that we should be discontent with are the very things that we find ourselves hopelessly discontented with. For example, we find ourselves discontented with our stuff. Destructive discontent pushes us to buy more, to always be looking for the next big thing, for the new thing, thinking that there's always something that's bigger and better. That's what compels us to shop around for clothes, for cars, for houses, even shop around for churches, and dare I say, even for spouses. God must look down on us and kind of feel the way that we would feel when we give somebody who we really care about a special gift. And that person then, after the fact, asks us for one of those gift receipts. It's as if we're saying to God, I don't like what you have given to me, and I'd like to trade it in for something better than what you gave to me. I want to see if I can do better than that. This destructive discontent is pervasive in our culture. So, what can we do about it? We can be rebels. We can rebel against our culture, against this message of our culture, of our society, that our value is found in the stuff that we can accumulate. Referring again to that book by Adam Hamilton called Enough, he offers 4 keys that can help us to find contentment. And I want to share these keys with you. The first is 4 words that we can repeat to ourselves when we find ourselves discontent. Simple words. It could be worse. It could be worse. John Ortberg, who is pastor at a well-known Presbyterian church called Menlo Park in California, he says that there are 4 words that we should say whenever we find ourselves discontented with something or with someone. It could be worse. This essentially is the practice of looking on the bright side or trying to find the silver lining with whatever circumstances we're faced with in life. It's recognizing that no matter what we may not like about a thing or about a person or a circumstance, that we can always find something good to focus on if we will choose to do so. The second of these keys to contentment that Hamilton offers in his book Enough is this question to ask ourselves: for how long will this make me happy? That is, something that you're about to acquire, something that you're going to do. How long will this make me happy? So often we buy something thinking that it's going to make us happy, only to find that the happiness only lasts about as long as it takes to drive it home and get it out of the box. And there is a moment of satisfaction when we make the purchase, but the item does not continue to give us satisfaction over time. Many of the things that we buy simply are not worth the expense. That's why it's a good idea when we can to try before you buy, to figure out really what is the value of this thing for you. The third of these keys to contentment that Hamilton offers in his book Enough is to develop a grateful heart. Gratitude is essential if we are to be content. The Apostle Paul has some important words to say about that. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18, Paul says, "Give thanks in all circumstances." Gratitude to God and contentment with what we have and where we are is the secret that Paul spoke of in his letter to the Philippians. It's in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. He writes, "I've learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, or having plenty and of being in need." A grateful heart recognizes that all of life is a gift. Contentment comes when we spend more time giving thanks for what we have than time that we spend thinking about what's missing or what's wrong in our lives or in the world. That brings us to the fourth of those keys to contentment. And it's the answer to this question: where does your soul find true satisfaction? The world answers this question by telling us that we find satisfaction in ease and luxury and comfort and money. The Bible, on the other hand, answers this question very differently. From Genesis to Revelation, it tells us that we find our satisfaction in God. The psalmist in Psalm 63 says, "O God, you are my God. I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My soul is satisfied as with a rich feast, and my mouth praises you with joyful lips, when I think of you and meditate on you in the watches of the night." And then Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew and elsewhere that the two most important things we must do in this life are, first, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and second, to love your neighbor as yourself. If we keep our focus on those two things above all else, we will find satisfaction for our souls and lasting contentment. So the choice is yours. The choice is ours. You and you alone determine if you will live according to the secret of contentment or of discontentment. You choose it in large part by deciding what your life is really about. If you decide that life does not consist in an abundance of possessions, then you are choosing contentment. I invite you to do that, starting today. Amen.